Hello, senior saints. Oh, how I miss seeing you. And this is Betty Gray, alias Betsy Dingy. And I'm on campus now to record for you for 2021, one of my dramas. It's a drama that requires no costumes, but I hope you will find yourself in this drama, which is called The King and the Prince. I hope to see you all next year. The King and the Prince. Long, long ago, in a far-away land, there lived a king. Oh, he was a good king. In fact, he was kind and he was just. And this king loved his people and they loved him. In fact, every morning he would get on his white stallion and ride out to all of the Providence, and there receive their praise and also their concerns. He loved ruling over this mighty, vast empire. He loved living in the magnificent castle. But more than he loved his people, and more than he loved ruling over this vast, mighty empire, and more than he loved living in this castle, he loved a little boy. And I'm sure you have already guessed, this was the prince. And regardless of his busy schedule, every evening, just before the dinner hour, he would meet with the prince in the garden. And since the prince was only 4 years old, sometimes they would just play. And then sometimes there was a story time, but always the story time, even though it was different, it was the same. Because the story was when this prince grew up, he would be the ruler of this vast and mighty empire. Now, the nanny who always brought the little prince to the garden, one day she couldn't find him. She had him all dressed in his robe, ready to go to the garden to meet the king. And he liked to play hide-and-seek, but not when it was to go to the garden, because he loved going where his father was in the garden. Many times a day, he would even ask, "Is it time yet to go to the garden?" So she began to call his name, and even though it might have been hide and seek, when she would say, "It's time to go to the garden," he would come right away. She began to call, "It's time to go to the garden. It's time now to go to the garden." And she didn't see the prince. She asked the servants frantically, "Has anyone seen the prince? It's almost time to go to the garden." No one had seen the prince. Now the little 4-year-old prince had seen that the huge brass door was left ajar. It was never opened. So he ran over to the door and he peeked through. Sure enough, he could see the castle. And there he could see the garden. And he didn't need the nanny. And so he thought he could just wedge himself through, and sure enough, he did. He ran to the garden, but there was no king, and he would play a little while, but as he ran around in the garden, he had asked his father over and over about the massive forest that surrounded the castle. And he would tell him a story. "Oh, son, one day, you and I will get on our white stallion horses, and we'll call the hounds, and we will take our guns and we will go hunting in the forest." Well, no one was around, so why not go hunting? He didn't have a horse, of course, but You know, he knew how to make a make-believe horse out of a stick, and he could make a gun out of a make-believe stick. And so how exciting. So he ran as fast as he could to the forest. When he got there, he looked up and the trees were so tall, but he had to find that perfect stick now for his horse. And he began to run further, but as he got further and further into the forest, it was dense underbrush, and he began to stumble, and he began to fall. But he would have to find this horse, and he would have to find his gun. So he would go a little further, and the more further he went into the forest, the thicker the underbrush and the briars. And not only did he stumble, but he began to fall, and he was getting dirty. And he noticed that his cloak was fastening on the briars, and he would pull and pull and pull, and it began to tear it. But he had to find his horse. But the further he went, oh, the darker it got. And there was there was a stick, and that would be his horse, and he would be just fine. But then it began to get dark. And he always loved dinner with the king, and he was hungry. And he was known in the whole land as the 4-year-old prince that never cried. But he couldn't help it. He began to cry. And the further he went, the dirtier he got. And it was tearing his cloak, and the noises of the night were terrible, and he cried all night. By dawn the next morning, he had to find his way back to the castle. Which way had he come? He had forgotten. And for 3 days and 3 nights, the prince was lost in the vast forest. Now, when they had not found the king, searching the castle all night, they searched from the tower to the dungeon. And when they couldn't find him, the next morning all the troops of the land were summoned. A great reward was offered for anyone who could bring back the prince to the castle. For 3 days, finally he heard a noise. Finally he was safe back at the castle, but instead it was a village. So, running up to the nearest man, he pulled on his cloak and said, Sir, I am the prince. Can you please take me back? Oh, you're not our prince. Look at all your clothes. You've been crying, haven't you? Our prince doesn't even cry. You're dirty. You're nothing but an urchin. Urchin? He had never heard of an urchin. Walking up to the next man, pulling on his cloak. Please, sir, I really am the prince. Can you please take me back to the castle? Oh, you're not our prince. Look at you. You're dirty. You're filthy. You've been crying. Everyone wants to be the prince. Everyone wants to get the reward. You're nothing but an urchin. Urchin. Thinking that a lady's heart would be softer, he walked up to her. Ma'am, please, as he pulled on her dress. Please, can you help me? Please, can you help me? I am the prince. You're not our prince, and I don't have anything. You're not going to steal from me. No, you be gone. You're nothing but a street urchin, as she gave him a kick and spit on the ground in front of him. Urchin. He had never heard of a street urchin. And then he heard a shopkeeper call, "Get out of here! Get out of here! You nothing but a street urchin!" And he noticed it did look like him. He was a little bigger, but he was dirty, and his clothes were all ragged. And he began to run, and he had a loaf of bread, and he was hungry, so he ran after the urchin. Maybe that's what he was. The beep people said he wasn't the prince. And when the urchin was out of view of the shopkeeper, he sat down and he began to eat the bread. And the prince looked at him, and the little urchin pulled off a piece of bread and handed it to the prince. Now the prince was so hungry, he grabbed it in his mouth with all of his strength. Urchin, he found out what a street urchin was. They had to steal for everything they ate. They went through all the garbage. And at that night, his newfound friend, the street urchin, invited him to sleep under a dirty old men's cloak to keep warm under the bridge. Well, days melted into weeks, and weeks into months, and months into years. And because royal blood flowed through his veins, he became the leader of the urchins. And then they were called outlaws. Oh, he became the leader. They would steal horses, and they would ride by the castle, and they would spit on the ground because that meant authority, and now they were the authority. The kingdom had never known such violence. There wasn't anything they wouldn't do. The stealing, raping, oh yes, and even murder. The whole kingdom was afraid of these outlaws. And so, from the castle itself, an edict went out through all the land that anyone who could capture the leader of the most notorious outlaws in all of the land would receive a great reward. One of the alias friends, the leader of the outlaws, one of his own men turned him in and showed them where the hideout was. And so he was captured and taken back to the castle in the courtroom. And there before the judge, by his own admission that he was the leader of the most notorious outlaw that this land had ever known. And so the judge sentenced him to the gallows to be hung until he died on the morrow. But as the guards was bringing the prisoner out, the captain of the guard stared at him and said, "Halt!" And they stopped. And he stared some more and he said, "Young man, how old are you?" "I don't know how old I am, but I can tell you who I am. I am the most notorious outlaw in all of the land." And yet he wouldn't let them pass. He said, "Young man, you look to be about 18. I told you I don't know how old I am, but I can tell you who I am," as he spit at the captain of the guards. The guard said, "You may pass." But immediately, the captain of the guards requested an audience with the king. And he said, "I must see him immediately." They escorted him into the king, and king said, "What's so urgent?" And he said, Sire, I think I have found your son." My son? What, what makes you think? Sire, just listen. It's not good news. I think the most notorious outlaw in all of the land is your son. Oh, why would you think that the most notorious outlaw, he's to be sentenced, I heard, on the morrow? Why would you think that's my son? Because, sire, he looks exactly like you when I first knew you. Sire, wouldn't he be about 18, 19 years old? Yes. He's been gone 14 years. He would be 18 his next birthday. Well, where is he? The king said. Where is he, if you think that's my son? Well, sire, you know it's not good news. He's in the dungeon. The king demanding torches be brought, and the guards, as they went down the long, narrow steps to the dungeon, the captain of the guards unlocked the door of the huge brass door, demanding that the torches go in first. And the king walking in with the guards. And when their eyes would adjust, for the first time, the king stood face to face with his own son. He ran over to embrace him. My son, my son. As he got closer, the alias prince pushed him down to the floor, the guards taking their spears to pierce him through, and the king shook his head. No. This is my son. I am not your son. If I had been your son, why didn't you find me? Oh, my son, I did everything that law and love demanded. Even to this very day, when I ride out to all the Providence, I look at the children and I ask them how old they are, thinking one might be you. Oh, my son, I've never stopped looking. Oh, I am not your son. Quit calling me your son. Please, believe me, you are my son. Look at my face. You are my son. As he tried to get closer, and the alias prince spitting in the king's face. The king trying to wipe the spittle and the tears from his eyes. No one had ever seen the king weep. Unashamedly, the tears were dripping down to his kingly robe. Again, the soldiers to try to kill him. No, please. This is my son. Oh, you stupid old man. You're nothing but a stupid old man. And the king said, but son, I loved you. Don't you remember? Remember our times in the garden? Don't you remember? For a moment, the alias prince stopped and took a breath. And then the king said, my son, I love you. I love you. You don't love me. If you had loved me, you would have found me. I'm not your son. As he started to lunge, and the guards again caught him. The king stopped, tears flowing down his face, and he said, my son, I love you. I loved you. The king would not turn his back on his son, began to back away as the guards backed with him. When he got to the door, he said, to prove my love for you, my son, you may go free. You would free me? I am the most notorious outlaw in all the land, and I am the leader. Let me go free. Oh, you're nothing but a stupid old man, as he began. And then all was dark. Now he called the king stupid, but he would not be that stupid. And then he thought, I didn't hear the lock click. So feeling the wall to find the door, he got to the door. He believed it actually gave a little bit. When his body up against the door to push, and it was unlocked. Well, he couldn't believe that. He could see the light at the top of the stairs. Well, there would be guards there, but he crept little by little up the steps. And when he got to the top of the steps, there were no guards. Now, talk about a stupid king. He said he could go free, but he didn't really believe it. Oh, he couldn't wait to get back to the hideout. And there, what a celebration. That night, they would make this land regret that they had let him go. Oh, there was stealing and raping, and oh, yes, they had to find the one who turned him in and murder him right in front of all of the outlaws. And they did. All week long, there was a celebration. The land was in great fear, because the leader of the outlaws had been let go. But at the end of the week, the king got the news that to satisfy the penalty for wrong, the king himself had gone to the gallows in his son's place. And you say, Betty, Tell me the rest of that story. Surely such love would have brought the prince back to the castle. Well, you see, I can't tell you the end of that story, because only you can finish that story. For you are the prince. You are the prince. For while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us.